In this section, let's understand one of the most important topics in list, that is list comprehensions. List comprehension is a substitute to for loops, and it is a technique for transforming list, string, or any iterable into new list. So during this transformation, elements within the original iterable can be conditionally included in the new list, and each element can be transformed as required. A good list comprehensions can make your code more expressive and thus easier to read. One advice is make list comprehensions as simple as possible so that it will become easy to decode later. List comprehensions are basically used to represent a complex code in a very simple way. If the code becomes complex, it is always advisable to not use list comprehensions because the whole idea of using the list comprehension will be violated. Let's understand list comprehensions with more detail. This is the general template which can be followed for list comprehensions in Python. This can serve as the basic and the most simple template, and it can get more and more complex as you add conditions to it. The square brackets in the template are the signature to represent list comprehensions. The for keyword followed by a variable that symbolizes a list item. As you already know, we use for loops to repeat a block of code a fixed number of times. List comprehensions are actually good alternatives to for loops as they are more compact. And the in keyword, which makes the for to traverses on every element of a iterable. So here, iterable can be any iterable such as string, tuple, and list. This is the power of list comprehension. It can identify when it receives a string or a tuple and work on it like a list. Finally, the outcome will be the list. List comprehension is an elegant way to define and create lists based on existing lists. So let's understand the concept with an example. So first of all, let's create an example without using list comprehensions and then write the same code using the concept of list comprehensions. Consider this example. So this will iterate over the list of numbers generated by range function. As we already know, a range function generates a list of numbers from 0 to 9, excluding 10 in this case, and performs the square of the number and append to new list. Here in this program, initially empty list is created and assigned to a variable new underscore list. And this for loop will iterate over the list generated by range function and append square of the number to new underscore list. So this will be the output generated by this particular program. As we can see in the output, this particular program will return you the list, which basically consisting of square of all the numbers which is generated by the range function. However, we can write the same code using list comprehension. So this is how we can write the same program using list comprehensions. If you notice in this representation, here also we are using a range function. So range is a built-in function which generates list sequence from 0 to 9, and for in the representation will loop over the element of the list, and this expression will perform the square of the number and append to the new underscore list variable. However, not every loop can be rewritten as list comprehensions, but as you get comfortable with list comprehensions, you will find yourself replacing more and more loops with this elegant syntax. So what is the important point to remember while we are writing a list comprehension is use square brackets, which basically represents you are dealing with list comprehensions, and this for loop will iterate over the elements which is generated by the range function, and expression has to be written in this particular place. How basically this comprehensions works is for loop will iterate over every element generated by the range function, and this expression will be applied on every number generated by the range function. And in this case, it performs the square of the number, and whatever it is returning will be appended to the new underscore list variable. So now let's understand the list comprehension with more examples so that the concepts would be clear. Suppose if you want to separate the letters of the word Python and add the letters as items of a list, to perform this operation, we can use this particular piece of code without using list comprehensions. So when we run the program, we will get this output. So what exactly happening in this example is, here this for loop will iterate over the string Python and separate the letters of the word and add the letters as items of a list. Hence, we get the following output. As we can see in the output, all the letters of the string Python is separated and added as a separate element to the list. Anyways, the same problem can be solved by using list comprehensions like this. Here in this representation, this will iterate through the letter of the string Python and separate the letters of the word and add the letters as items of the new list. As we can see in the output, this also will generate the same output as before. This is how we can actually replace the program which we have written before. Now let's understand how to use list comprehension along with conditional statements. List comprehensions can utilize conditional statement like if and else to modify existing lists. Consider this program are written without list comprehension. Now let's understand what this program is going to do. So here in this program, this for loop will iterate over the list of numbers generated by range function. Here range function generates a list of numbers from 0 to 19. And here the if statement will check each number generated by the range function is divisible by 2. And if the number is divisible by 2, then the number will be appended to new underscore list, which we have created initially with an empty list. As we can see in the output, the elements of the list generated in the program are divisible by 2. So the same program can be written by using the list comprehensions as well. So this is how we can write the same code using list comprehension. Here in the comprehension, this for loop will iterate over the items of the list generated by the range function from 0 to 19 and then checks the value is divisible by 2. So when you are writing an if condition, if condition must be written after the for syntax. In this case, if the number divisible by 2, then it will be append to the new list, new underscore list. As we can see in the output, the elements of the list generated in this program are divisible by 2. So the program with list comprehensions and without list comprehensions have produced the same result. So list comprehensions also supports nested if statement. So in our previous example, we have used only a single if statement. So we can also use nested if statements in the case of list comprehensions. Consider this program and it is written without list comprehensions, and later we will write the same program using list comprehension concepts. So this program will iterate over the list of numbers generated by range function. Here range function generates a list of numbers from 0 to 99 and check number divisible by 2. And if the number is divisible by 2, then the same number is checked whether the number is divisible by 5. If the number is divisible by both 2 and 5, then number will be appended to new underscore list. As we can see in the output, the elements of the list generated in this program are divisible by 2 and 5. Let's write the same code using list comprehensions. So this is how we can represent the same program using the list comprehensions. Here in this program, this for will iterate over the list of numbers generated by range function. Again, here range function will generate a list of numbers from 0 to 99, and then this if statement will check the each number whether it is divisible by 2. So then it will go to this particular statement only if the number is divisible by 2. So if the number is divisible by 2, then checks the same number is divisible by 5 or not. And if the number is divisible by both 2 and 5, then only the number will be appended to the list new underscore list. As we can see in the output, the elements of the list generated in this program are divisible by 2 and 5. Till now we have understood that we can use the conditional statements in list comprehensions as well. Additionally, we can use the if-else conditions in list comprehensions. Using if-else condition in list comprehensions is little tricky. Let's understand this with an example. Consider this program written without list comprehensions. What this particular program does is, so here this for loop will iterate over the list of items generated using the range function. In this case, range function will generate a list of items, range starting from 0 to 9. And inside the for loop, this if statement will check whether the number generated by the range function is divisible by 2. If the number is divisible by 2, then the string even will be appended to new underscore list. If the number is not divisible by 2, then the string odd is appended to the new underscore list. As we can see in the output, if the number is even, then the even string is appended to the new underscore list. And if the number is not divisible by 2, then the string odd is appended. So let's write the same code using a list comprehensions. So as I've already told, if else is tricky in comprehensions. If only if statements, then the condition is written after for loop. If it is if else condition, then statements are written before for loop like this. Let us understand how the flow of this particular program will happen. So here the for loop will iterate over the list of items generated by the range function from 0 to 9. If the number is divisible by 2, then the string even is appended to the new list new underscore list. And if the number is not divisible by 2, then the string odd is appended to the new list new underscore list. As we can see in the output, when the number is divisible by 2, string even is appended. And if the number is not divisible by 2, then the string odd is appended to the list. So list comprehensions also supports nested loops. So we have understood in our earlier lectures that we can use for loop inside a for loop, which forms the nested loops. Since we use the for loops in the list comprehensions also supports nested loops. Suppose we need to compute a transpose of a matrix which requires nesting of for loops. So let's understand what is transpose of matrix first. The transpose of a matrix is a new matrix whose rows are the columns of the original. So this makes the columns of the new matrix the rows of the original. Basically it reverses. The rows will become a columns and the columns will become a rows. Suppose if you know matrix in linear algebra, so it will be having a rows and a columns. The transpose of a matrix is where the rows will become a columns and the columns will become a rows. So let's understand how to achieve this particular task without list comprehensions and by using list comprehensions. So this is the example how the output should look like. So this is the original list and this should be the output. As we can see here, this is the transpose list because the rows have become the columns and the columns have become the rows. Now let's see how it is done without using list comprehensions. So this is the code to perform the transpose of a matrix without a list comprehensions. This code uses two for loops to find transpose of a matrix. This for loop will iterate over the items by the range from 0 to 1. For the value 0, the nested for loop will fetch the 0th index of the nested lists one after the other. Hence, transposed first nested list will be holding the 0th element of all nested lists. And for the value 1, the nested for loop will fetch the first index of the nested lists one after the other. Hence, transposed second nested list will be holding the first element of all nested lists. Hence, this will produce the following result. We can also perform nested iteration inside a list comprehension. In this section, we will find transpose of a matrix using a nested loop inside list comprehensions. Let's write the same code using comprehensions. So the important thing to note here is the nested loops in list comprehensions don't work like normal nested loops. In this program, this particular for loop is executed before this particular for loop. Hence, at first a value is assigned to I, then item directed by row of I is appended in the transpose variable. Let's understand how the flow of the program happens. So here in this case, this will iterate over the items by the range from 0 to 1. So for the value 0, the nested for loop will fetch the 0th index of the nested lists one after the other. Hence, transposed nested list will be holding the 0th element of all nested lists. For the value 1, the nested for loop will fetch the first index of the nested lists one after the other. Hence, transposed second nested list will be holding the first element of all nested lists. Hence, this will produce the following result. We must be very careful while we are using the list comprehensions. If the list comprehensions are becoming complicated, then it is better not to use them, because the whole idea of using the list comprehensions is to make your code look very simple. But when your code becomes complex, then the whole idea of using the list comprehension is violated. Hence, make a decision properly before using the list comprehensions. For some situations, it works perfectly fine. In some situations, it makes the code much more complex. In this section, we have understood all the possible ways of using the list comprehensions. So that's all for this video. So let us know if you have any questions. Thanks for watching. Let's meet in the next video. Thank you.